Welcome to our next episode of Powered by Play. Today we are talking about playing fear and mortality because not all play requires safety, comfort, or pleasant imagery.
Hi, this is Avery, and we will be discussing play in the context of fear and scary, spooky vibes such as horror movies, haunted mazes, horror escape rooms, and roller coasters. All the ways that we like to feel the thrill of being alive.
We also have our very first guest on Powered by Play, so I would like to introduce Dr. Christian Seiter, who is assistant professor at California State University Fullerton in Fullerton, California. And Christian, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what's going on here.
Thank you so much, Avery and Drew. I'm honored to be your first guest. As you mentioned, I am a professor at California State University Fullerton, and I study the sunny side of death. Specifically, I am interested in the ways in which we can use the lighter aspects of communication to make such a scary and challenging topic more approachable, meaningful, and dare I say, at times, fun.
What? Death can be fun?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's not to say that we want to always take death lightly, right? I never want to minimize the seriousness of death. However, I do think by finding the lighter aspects of it, we can do a lot of good for society. Death denial causes a lot of harmful things. So engaging with it in a playful way can help people be able to approach it when they really need to during those high stakes moments. I firmly believe that.
All right. So, Christian, since you are our guest today, I'm going to have you press play and begin for us.
Okay, so what I've been thinking about a lot ever since I was invited onto this podcast is what is it about the context of play that makes fear fun or appealing, particularly fear of death, something that most people would prefer to avoid at all costs. To get the nuance of that, I've also been curious to discuss when fear and death is not fun in a play context, whether it's a desirable or an undesirable death in the context of play. I've also been thinking a lot about other what may be classified as negative emotions. So certainly fear, but I've also been curious about dread because I've had a lot of really fun moments when playing, and dread is the primary emotion that I would describe what I was feeling in that moment. Risk is in general a really interesting aspect of play because I think it gives stakes, and stakes for me are what makes things immersive and fun when I play.
Yeah, I remember learning about stakes during my high school improv that I would practice. One of the parts of improv is how do you make a scene more interesting and more funny and more engaging for the audience? Raise the stakes. Something has to be at risk, and something has to be able to be lost or gained through whatever scene that you're playing. It also reminds me of hide and seek, where there's kind of a thrill in the anticipation of being found, because it's fun to hide, but only if there's someone to find you, right? Like if you're hiding for a week and no one's chasing after you, there's not really any more of that thrill. So there's kind of that excitement of, oh my gosh, I got found, or oh no, I accidentally made a noise and got myself caught. And that kind of cycle of hiding and seeking is kind of what makes that game fun because it's replayable and the stakes are high all the time. And we also like to play with stakes in our imaginations with childhood games too, of like, what if it was hide and seek, but horror? What if our lives were really at stake? Or what if we're playing truth or dare, or tag, or would you rather, and it's actually a horror movie? And because those are actual horror movies that I just listed that exist. Even Squid Game too, the international phenomenon of childhood games turned violent, and Deathful is also another piece of media as an example. Believing that your life is at risk is what makes a scary ride or a scary maze fun. And being chased in a maze is what makes it fun. Like if you're just it is scary to walk through a maze with, scary lighting and scary sound effects, but what about what's in your heart? Like the stuff that's going on in your heart is kind of what makes that fun. Wouldn't you say, Drew?
I think so. And I was also thinking about shows like Cirque du Soleil or other shows where there are, I suppose you could call them death defying tricks or moments, acrobatics, trapeze artists, aerial silks kinds of things. And I was talking to my partner last night about what is scarier. Is it scarier if there's no net? And these performers could really fall to their deaths? Or is it scarier if there is a net and you're wondering, oh, I hope this person is going to be okay. I hope they're not going to need the net. So stakes are a really interesting question because this reminds me of the notorious things that happened on Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, where I know there was at least one, but I think there were a couple of actors who got really injured while performing that musical. And the story of the musical became not about, oh, there's this interesting connection between Spider-Man and Julie Taymor and U2. It became, oh, that's the show where people got hurt, and that was what people knew about it. So, risk and exactly what that kind of risk is and what are the stakes. But in a magic show, for example, even if it looks like somebody is going to be chopped in half, or even if it looks like somebody has been chopped in half, there's something I think in the back of our minds that knows the stakes weren't actually that high. But the pleasure and the playfulness is in thinking, but what if? What if?
That's such an interesting point, Drew. And as I was researching for this show, I came across a concept known as a positive negative experience, which is the idea that play is distressing and intense, but also gratifying as it creates new experiences, reflections, or insights for the player. And that's from a scholar named Hope Metsa from an article in 2008. But I thought that was extremely relevant. The positive negative experience, insofar as these are emotions that no one in their right minds would seek out in the quote unquote real world. But in play, we can't get enough of those positive, negative experiences.
And I think also when we look at risk and we look at stakes, the scholar Jeremy Bentham talked about deep play. And Clifford Geertz also talked about deep play, which was all encompassing. The stakes were so high that, for example, Richard Schechner would say the stakes are so high that we can't figure out why anyone would play this at all. And then also there's a notion that's connected to deep play, which is dark play, which has the potential to cause harm or deceit or destruction. And in his book, Richard Schechner asks his students to talk about, are there times when you yourself have engaged in deep play or dark play? And he cites one of his students talking about going out to bars one night and just letting herself get a little bit intoxicated and then more intoxicated and then more intoxicated and seeing who she could pick up at the bar, where she would end up. And so the stakes obviously are very high, but there's something about that, I guess, dizziness or rush or what is possible. And then also when you're on a roller coaster, for example, you have to let go. You let go of control. And so maybe bar hopping is a way of letting go of your idea of I am in control, which is actually one of the reasons that I shy away from alcohol is because I don't like being out of control. I like being in control. And so I just thought that that was interesting that playfulness can even come from a sense of I'm not in control of my body.
That's really interesting that you bring up control too. As a kid, I grew up with OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. And there's a common stereotype that that's just like about organizing or germs and such, but it can be a debilitating mental illness that can take over your life. It's can be an obsession over control. But it's ironic because the whole point of it is that there are intrusive thoughts in your head that are not in your control. And the compulsions that you do to try to manage those intrusive thoughts are things that you choose to do, and yet they're it feels like they're out of your control because you're kind of at the mercy of your intrusive thoughts and anxieties. For example, there was a period in my life where I was afraid that if I didn't say goodnight to my parents, I would wake up and they would have been killed by a monster. Oh yeah, and that the internet and its existence of scary stuff was not very a great thing for me growing up because I would get these emails sometimes that's like a chain email of like, here's the scariest story of this lady who killed her children in a closet and, went on to haunt everything else. And those would just stick with me for like months on end. And I would have to sleep in my bedroom with the door a certain amount ajar because if it's closed then it's too dark, but if it's open then it's too vulnerable, so I have to have it slightly ajar so that I can see if there's movement, but if there's not then I'm like relatively feeling safe. But if my closet is open then that means that there's nobody hiding in the closet, but if it's closed then somebody could be, so I'm going to leave it a little bit open, but I'm also going to check it periodically to make sure that I'm safe. And you can probably tell that it was kind of a tiring experience for me. Quite a conundrum to have OCD and to have these fear-ridden anxieties and paranoias too. Some other common themes that I experienced in my intrusive thoughts were natural disasters. I was obsessive over, all kinds of natural disasters, all the ways that the world could end, and I would have to try to be ready for it. But the thing about a natural disaster is that you can't really predict it. I had not only these specific fears of like natural disasters and intruders and death and dying and all this, but it was also the fear of not having that control. Of this lack of control is making me scared.
I think control is a really interesting thing in the context of discussing death in play. A primal human desire. There's a very influential theory in psychology known as terror management theory, which basically posits that so much of what we do as human beings is to stave off the existential terror that we all know we are mortal. We all know that we're going to die. And what this theory says is that when these thoughts are activated in us, we have a couple of predictable responses. First is that we say, nah, no, I'm young, I'm healthy, I'm sexy, I'm rich, I'm important. I'm not going to die anytime soon. And then as those death thoughts sink in deeper, or if they're activated in the subconscious to begin, some very interesting things that are relevant to play arise. Specifically, human beings, when subconscious death thoughts are activated, or if you were thinking about death and then just later on in the day, you're no longer actively thinking about it, but it's still in your brain, it's still in there, you are most likely to engage in what is known as worldview defense. You are likely to go into your in groups and exclude out groups. You are likely to do things that make you feel safe, like you're part of something, like you're part of something meaningful. There have been some very interesting studies that have scary implications with regard to people who have been had death thoughts activated if they are belong to a particular religious group, right? They're way more likely to be antagonistic towards people of a different religious group, for example. In the context of play, I found an article regarding sports team loyalty. That was pretty interesting. So there was an experiment done. There were a couple of experiments done in which there were fans of sports teams who were reminded that they were mortal, that they are going to die. They were asked to think about their deaths. And what resulted was expressed greater optimism about the results of their sports team's success in that particular season. Even more interesting than that is that there was for college football. Before the season began, they were asked, do you feel like you are a bigger fan of your local college sports team who's not super successful in the past, or a very successful national basketball team? So they were asked before the season, and people responded that they felt a stronger affiliation towards the local college football team. Then the college football team lost their first game, and the loyalty switched to the national basketball team. So when death thoughts were activated, there was a motivation to seek success affiliation with a group that was successful, which I think says a lot about our inherent desire to want to feel safe from death at all costs, which kind of causes a paradox in that we seek death when we play. So I feel like a lot of what we have to do with play, and particularly play that involves death, maybe some sort of narrative form of play in which death is quite literally a mechanical possibility. I think a lot of why we play is because we can't control death outside the context of play. And in the context of play, to some extent, we can. We can say, I don't want to play anymore. Or, well, at least I didn't die in real life. Just my character died.
Yeah, when children are playing a video game and they die in the game and they get really upset, the parents' first response is probably, "Well, at least you didn't die in real life."
Yeah. And I love the idea that we can try to do things in play that we wouldn't be able to do in real life in order to say, well, look, I can do this superhuman feat because even though I'm mortal, I can pretend that I have a little something extra. So, for example, if you're Mario, you can jump further than you would be able to. Or if you are, I was just watching a playthrough of one of the Nancy Drew adventure games where she learns how to use a lariat to lasso something. And so she lassos this tree branch in order to climb up this cliff. And so I guess the question is, how can I be, because I'm aware of my mortality, I'm aware that I'm just kind of traveling around the world in this body that is breaking down and its capabilities are sort of finite. But if I can use some kind of avatar to bolster that, or maybe that's also part of going to the gym too, you know? I'm going to stave off my mortality by doing what I can to increase my strength and decrease the chance at any given day I will have something happen to my body that will harm me. If I'm strong, if I'm healthy, I have a better chance of moving through the world in a less vulnerable position.
There are some fun internet videos online of people working out at the gym, and they're holding, like, a full sword or a shield or, like, a fake gun, and they're, like, all suited up and just on the treadmill and just, like or with a samurai sword. Um, Whenever I see those, it definitely reminds me of all the apocalyptic phases that we might go through in our lives. For example, as a teen, I did read a good amount of young adult fiction, and there are so many young adult books about apocalypses, zombie apocalypses, totalitarian apocalypses, dystopian worlds, the undead, the supernatural, just the stories of the world as we know it is going to get overrun by these undead creatures or these forces beyond our control, and then it's just going to be down to us to see who can survive, down to our primal natures, our instincts. It's now every person for themselves, and you like who are you in that moment? Who are you when things that we never thought were possible are now our reality? And those themes of survival in games or shows like The Walking Dead really pair morality with mortality too. When you have limited resources, you have you have other strangers who can ask you for help. Are you going to say no? Are you going to offer somebody your last food ration and maybe get a few points of approval? Like in The Walking Dead, that's how it works. In the video game, at least in The Walking Dead. You are invited to play in this scenario in which you have agency and you can make these choices. Who are you? And then who are you once you leave the game? It's very fascinating. And oh, it also reminds me of the videos online as well where people dress up as like a monster in a parking garage or a public bathroom and like scare the heck out of random strangers and chase them and stuff. And you see just normal people just like running for their lives. That kind of ties into the invisible theater idea of Boal that we discussed on a previous episode of let's set up this camera and see how people react to being faced with life or death. It's so fascinating how we keep wanting to see that and we keep wanting to experience this ongoing question.
Avery, in your studies, I was again as in researching for this appearance, I encountered a couple of different concepts that I thought were really interesting, and they sound like a lot of what you're talking about here. Um, Two concepts, one of them being meaningful play, which is the idea that the relationship. This is a direct quote from the article by Salin and Zimmerman, 2004. Meaningful play is the relationship between player action and system outcome, both of which must be discernible and integrated into the larger context of the game. In layman's terms, like you said, the players feel like they have a chance to meaningfully affect the game, that their choices really matter. And this other study by Sidhu and Carter, 2021, took it a step further. And they considered the concept of, or they offered the concept of pivotal play, which is the idea that these are play sessions that are appealing, memorable, and transformative, such that they transcend game boundaries. Have y'all had a pivotal play experience that stands out to you based on that definition? I was kind of wondering about that.
I can think of two games that come to mind. The first is Hades, which is a rogue-like dungeon crawler based on the Greek mythology pantheon. And it came out in recent years and has been a really, really big hit due to the hundreds and hundreds of dialogue that you'll come across during your run of the game. So the premise of the game is that you're playing Zagreus, who is a son of Hades and Persephone, and Zagreus lives in the House of Hades, in the underworld, but he's trying to escape. Every time that he tries to escape the underworld, he has to fight all these monsters, and if your health points run out, you die. But every time that you die, you just respawn into the House of Hades because you're immortal. And and I keep saying you, but I also mean you as the player, you as Zagreus, you equals the character, which is a fun thing that we do when we play games. You are the character. Every time that you die, you can just you can try again. You can upgrade your stats, you can pick a different weapon, you can try to give gifts to different people and see what happens. And again and again and again, and you just keep on cycling through this cycle of trying to escape and dying. And then I don't really want to spoil the end, but if you do escape, is that really escape? And that kind of question conundrum there. And the second game that I wanted to mention is called Frostpunk, which is a city builder where you're building a city. However, this game is set in a ice apocalypse in London. You have to build your city with limited coal and resources and electricity and limited heat when these below freezing temperatures are overtaking the entire world. And you, as the leader of this colony society, you have to not only, place houses or whatever and divide up your resources and choose which workers are mining coal and which ones are chopping wood. But you also get to choose policy that shapes you as either a totalitarian dictator or a religious cult leader, all in the name of survival and keeping your people alive. Not only is this game exciting and thrilling in a way that many city builders are not, it's also very philosophical in the way that it asks, who are you when you are in the midst of an apocalypse? Who are you when you are faced with a group of stragglers hanging out and trying to survive out in the blizzard? Do you help them? Do you take them in? Do you have the resources to take them in? And then the whole question of like, are you going to make it through this blizzard? Are you going to make it through this storm? Some of these are yes or no questions, and some of these are really long-winded, eternal questions that we all deal with.
I think an interesting concept I came across. This is probably something that you're familiar with. I'm not much of a video game player myself. There is a Frostpunk board game, by the way. I'm a big board gamer.
There is.
But there is a concept known as permadeath, which essentially is permanent death. So you were talking about respawning earlier. And I think that's a really interesting idea is how if you're playing a game in which permadeath is a mechanical reality versus well, you can just, respawn and, or maybe there's some sort of happy medium like in D&D, your character dies, but you get to keep playing and they're going to find you in the next prison conveniently tied up and you have the same vendetta against the bad guy that they happen to have, just integrating you into the story. But permadeath, I think, is very interesting because in the real world, again, quote unquote, all our deaths are permadeath. I guess depending on of what you believe, of course, that spiritually that may differ. But in general, I feel like the feeling of dying on Earth feels like a permadeath, whereas in games. It's a choice made by the designer, and I think it is, in terms of play experience, a really meaningful one. Do y'all tend to find that you're drawn towards games that feature permadeath, or do you prefer a more forgiving system, I suppose, that allows you to respawn?
For me personally, I do prefer a little bit more forgiving system because I don't need to feel super skilled or expert in terms of a game. I would rather explore the story and experience the whole story and see the world of the game much more than I would rather, have the stakes be so strict. And I know in challenging games like Mario or The Last of Us, there are people out there who are really invested in playing permadeath, where if you die, you have to restart the entire game. And The Last of Us is hours long. It is, I don't remember how many hours, but it's tens of hours long of a video game. And there are people out there who treat it like it's like you get one life. And I think that is so fascinating and hard and very difficult.
Yeah, I've also seen people who are invested in finding every single death cutscene they can. So I've seen YouTube videos that literally line up, okay, these are all the different ways that your character can die. And so the person will just watch all of and people curate this. People go through and they say, okay, every single time this character dies by fire, let's get that. Or every time this person falls to their death. And people sit there and watch the videos. And I kind of think that's fascinating. I remember back in the day when Dragon's Lair, the arcade game, first came out, and you were Dirk the Daring, and this was an arcade game that had the first sort of animation. And you died all the time. And it was sort of, I mean, you respawned, but you spawned kind of a ways back from where you were. But those cut scenes, those cut death scenes, were really pretty fascinating. And so people really didn't care sometimes how far they got in the game because they just wanted to watch Dirk die.
You bring up an interesting point here, Drew, and I think it's also worthwhile to consider that we're talking a lot about death of us as the character, like our proxy character dying, right? But in games, you also inflict death on others. Depending on who those others may be, it's a different feeling, right? So if I'm inflicting death upon a swath of non-player characters, okay, that feels very different from, oh, well, this non-player character was evil, but they were developed. So I don't know. There's usually a satisfaction in inflicting death upon those kinds of characters, as opposed to maybe a sympathetic non-player character. I'm a dungeon master, and I've had players where often the most moving moments of the campaign are a beloved non-player character rolls a critical failure and they die a horrible death. And it's a very tragic moment usually. And it's like, this was, you weren't even playing this character. This was just a companion who made silly jokes with you that you always kind of laughed at. Or you're inflicting death on other players. Maybe you're very good friends. Like, my wife relishes that. Whenever we play a board game called Nemesis, which is basically a simulation of the movie Alien, which is terrific, right? And that game is awesome because you get two objectives at the very beginning of the game. One of them is nice, like you have to bring an egg into the escape pod, and the other's like Avery must not survive. Like it's extremely cruel. And midway through the game, when the alien shows up, you secretly pick which of those objectives secretly. So basically, the end of the story was Bailey, my wife, was there at an escape pod that has two seats. Two seats. My friend Danny was right there, and she had a choice to wait for him, and she just didn't. So Danny died a horrible death. We all laughed hysterically. Danny was a good sport about it. And then there was a bit of poetry because it turns out an alien had impregnated Bailey, and she didn't survive in the escape pod on the way home, so it worked out.
Oh my goodness.
But it's a crazy game. I highly recommend it. But it's a really interesting thing because it's like I feel like death in the context of other players, like your friends, you've entered this contract, and there's like a glee to it. There's kind of a devilish glee to it. So the I feel like the spectrum of emotions in response to death is so much broader and outside the context of play. Usually outside the context of play, it's a somber, there's anger, there's grief, even for people that like maybe I didn't even particularly like this person, but I'm sad that they're dead. I didn't want him to die, right? Whereas in a game, it's like, yeah, got him. I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, in Grand Theft Auto or GTA for short, there are a lot of NPCs, which is short for non-playable characters, and it's just a version of LA where people are just minding their own business, all of these computer-generated people walking around, and you just run them over. You can just, attack them, you can punch them, you can rob them, you can do all the crimes ever in this game. And no wonder parents are sometimes suspicious of the modern day video games because how I don't know, Drew. I think you have. Does your kid ever play like Counter Strike or first person shooter games or games where it's just all guns and violence? And how would you feel, if you saw a lot of that? I don't know if you do.
That's sort of like outside her window, I guess, but she does watch a lot of things like Avatar or Princess Mononoke or something like that, or back in the day, Harry Potter, where characters did die, and she would sort of talk about, oh, it was really sad that Jet died in Avatar, for example, because he was just starting to be helpful to Aang and his friends. And yet he got, crushed in Ba Sing Se. And so she would say something like that was sad, but then he wasn't Aang or Katara or Sokka or Toph. And so I think the idea that maybe some characters are expendable is an interesting idea too. And I was thinking about, especially with stuff like Grand Theft Auto, the whole Aristotelian thing of catharsis, where if you raise pity and fear during a play or during some kind of play experience, you deal with them in this metaphorical way and then you purge them, right? Catharsis just purges all that stuff that's inside you, whether it's just absolute sadness or whether it's some kind of violent impulse. Going to the theater supposedly, says Aristotle, helps you get rid of that. And I think that that's one of the things that people talk about when they talk about violence in movies or plays or things like that, things of that nature. I think it's still an open question. Does it help when you have these impulses to pound on an ogre so that you don't pound on the ogres that you have in your real life, you know? So I think that's still kind of an open question. Okay, for example, I watch movies that have stakes a lot and I see characters die a lot. And I was thinking also of musical Sweeney Todd, where I think you don't exactly know whether to cheer for Sweeney when he's killing people like Beetle Bamford or the judge and then stepping on that pedal and they go sliding down into the furnace. Or if you're kind of like, oh, Sweeney, no, that's one more life taken. The What is the quality of the life that is lost in the narrative, I think, is a good question too. Because, you guys, I remember I was watching this movie called The Lobster. Are you guys familiar with this movie?
No.
I've heard of it. It's a Yorgos Lanthimos, right?
Yeah, and that guy has some real dark stuff going on in his movie. So the conceit here is that all the single people in this community are brought to this hotel and they have a certain amount of time to find a partner. If they don't find a partner, then they are turned into an animal, and it's an animal of their choosing. And so it's called the lobster because the main character, his animal that he's going to turn into is a lobster. But in the process of the movie, I think it's his brother who turned himself into a dog and lives with the main character. And so, as much as in other movies, when I might see Indiana Jones kill a Nazi, or, one of the Space Marines and aliens shoot the heck out of an alien, when the person that, I'm sorry, this is a spoiler for those of you who haven't seen The Lobster, but this comes like halfway through the movie. When the person that the main character is dating comes and starts beating on the dog that his brother became, that was it for me. I was like, I will not watch this anymore. If you want to throw, and that was an NPC. I mean, the dog was kind of an NPC because you weren't really tracking it. But an animal, no, thank you. That is a whole other kettle of fish.
Christian, you look like you're thinking really hard about that.
It's a very interesting idea. Kind of going back to what you were saying about Frostpunk, how what boundaries are we willing to transgress in the context of play when there's a year of artifice, I suppose. What aspects of ourselves are we willing to suspend for the sake of pretend and engaging with imagination? And what are we absolutely not willing to suspend? Again, I guess I'm thinking in terms of D&D. Whenever I'm at Dungeons and Dragons, whenever I'm serving as the game master, the dungeon master, how to engage things that really matter, that give stakes, but are not going to traumatize anybody. And of course, that's going to be group dependent as well, right? Some groups are going to have some sensitivities to certain topics that others won't, or certain scenes or characters. What a bad guy or a villain can do is going to be really different depending on the group, right? Um, and I think death. Just kind of going into the D&D thing. Death is really interesting in the context of D&D because it's sort of a weird boundary because it can be permadeath, but if you're like high enough level, you can reverse it. So it's like you can you can reverse death, but you really have to earn it. You really have to earn it. It is not an easy thing to do, which is perhaps why I actually made my own homebrew D&D world all about death, in which actually it's illegal to use that kind of magic. Because I kind of wanted to explore that. Like, let's make the stakes even higher if you really want to engage with that. But yeah, it's what boundaries you're willing to transgress. So for Drew, it sounds like animals. For many people, it might be like children, like in Frostpunk, as you're mentioning. Or it's been a long time since I played it, but BioShock was a video game that I played. I think must have been late 2010, 2009, something like that. But they present you these moral quandaries with these little girls, though they're significantly they're kind of like demons almost in the way like they're evil or they're possessed by something evil, right? And you have a choice throughout the game of do I want to kill and harvest this entity that appears like a little girl to become more powerful, or do I want to essentially free them and absolve them of this evil entity within them? And it's a really fascinating moral quandary. And I remember that there are a lot of different endings to that game, depending on how many you harvested versus saved. And it was an extremely powerful thing. When are they escapism? And when are they actually asking you to engage with something deep? I think that's a really interesting point, Drew.
Drew, do you want to tell us about what it's like to work behind the scenes of a ghost tour?
Oh, sure. All right. So I occasionally moonlight as a tour guide for Haunted Orange County, Haunted OC, and I lead ghost tours for Fullerton and the Bowers Museum and the city of Orange. So I can talk a little bit about that. The first thing that we say as tour guides is that everything that we share on the tour is true. And it's true, but we don't say it's real. And what is truthfulness? Truthfulness is that these are first person accounts from people who have had these supernatural experiences. Or they're supernatural events that get written up in newspapers or other sort of records that indicate somebody saw this particular ghost here or this thing is rumored to have happened here. And I think as I've been doing these ghost tours, I have started to understand how important and impactful they are to some of the people who are on the tour. Some of the people just want to hear a good ghost story. And some of the stories are funny, some of the stories are frightening, and some are oddly touching. There are stories about encounters with ghosts where you really start to understand what the ghost was going through in life and why they seem to be stuck between this world and the next. And so sometimes it's just to hear a good story, but sometimes the guests on the tours want to talk about their own experiences. And that, for me, gets very powerful. I had one guest, for example, talk about when he was a young boy, he traveled to Mexico and he and his family were staying in a small house that had been in their family for generations. And this was a house that, instead of doors, had curtains sort of covering the doorways. And so when he was listening to the adults, he was the only kid in this group. He was listening to the adults and just starting to get bored of hearing about family gossip and that kind of thing. And so he started watching the curtain that led to one of the bedrooms in the house. And he saw someone lying in the bedroom, in the bed. It was a man. And he kind of looked to see what was going on with the man, and he could see the man breathing, but the man was starting to kind of be distressed in how he was breathing. And he just kind of thought nothing of it and didn't want to interrupt the adults and ask, who's in that bedroom? Do we need to help them or anything like that? When he got back to the States, he finally talked to his parents. And he said, who was that man who was in Tia's house? And his parents said, what man? There was nobody there. And he described this man that he'd seen in the bed, and his parents' eyes just opened wide. And they said, that was, I think it was his great uncle. And you probably don't remember him, but he came and visited us in the United States when you were very, very young. I think you were maybe 1 year old. And he had a lot of fun with you. And before he left, he said to you, I really want to see you again. And I hope that you'll come down and see me in Mexico sometime. And so they said the man you're describing in the bed actually died in that room. And he looked exactly like the man that you're describing who came up to visit you. And when the man was telling this story, I mean, you could just see how much impact it had on him and the importance of family, but also this deep connection that this family member had of, I'm going to see you again. Whatever it takes, I'm going to see you again. So, talk about kind of stories or fear or questions of death having an impact and changing your life. It really seems to have done that for him.
One question I had for you, Drew, is what do you perceive are the needs that people are seeking to fulfill by going on your ghost tour? You get a sense that a lot of people believe in ghosts and want to engage in that, or do you think for people it's just like, oh, it's like a fun thing? It's like, oh, just like we go on a pizza tour, let's go on a ghost tour. What do you think are the underlying motivations of a lot of the people who you visit in that moment?
I think for a lot of people, it's just kind of a fun time and they get to listen to creepy stories. And they get to know that these creepy stories took place in their hometown. But for some people, I think it's validation. If there's someone who's telling a story like that, because if you are telling a story about a supernatural event that happened to you, it's not just about telling the story, it's about being believed. It's about, I'm going to tell you this story, and despite all evidence to the contrary, I want you to believe that what I'm saying actually happened. Even if you don't believe in ghosts, even if you've never seen a ghost, even if you think that death truly is the end, I want you to just go on this journey with me and put aside any doubts or any rationality that you have.
So it's almost a playful experience for your guests.
Yeah, I think so, because even though these tours happen at night, and some of the areas are kind of spooky, it is controlled. We were talking about control earlier. There's the control of we're in a big group. If anything threatened us, we really could probably fend it off. And by and large, we don't see the kinds of things that are there inside the buildings. We also stay outside the buildings in every location except the Bowers Museum. And so we can sort of look at the building and imagine the things that happened inside, but not be inside with them, be on the outside looking in.
I used to work at an escape room in Southern California, and one of our rooms was horror themed. And I also always wondered why people would go into a environment where they are spooked, and especially an immersive environment. I think if I were on your ghost tour, I would probably be more interested in that than being in a horror themed escape room for an hour, just because I personally I would rather play in that format of standing out on the outside, looking toward the house and using my imagination while knowing that I am just on a public street and I'm going to be okay. And even if I needed to step out, I can. And just not feeling like you are exactly in danger. Whereas there are people who pursue that, like the ghost tour, and then there are also people who pursue immersive horror, such as mazes and escape rooms. And there's an escape room in Southern California where every player has to wear a shock collar. And so while you're exploring the room, you have the opportunity to experience pain. And it is also a little spooky, and it's themed as though you are being experimented on and stuff like that. And to be honest, when I played that room with my escape room colleagues, I left the room. And it wasn't necessarily that the shocks were that bad. It was more so that I was too afraid to explore the room. So, in an escape room, in order to escape, you have to explore the room and press buttons and put your hands into things and see what things around the room do. But it got to a point during the room after we all, solved a few puzzles and we were, making our way through some of the puzzles during which a lot of us would get shocked. I just got to a point where we were able to access the next room, and I kind of poked around the next room and there was stuff on the wall that I could have touched, but I was too scared to touch any of the stuff because I didn't want to get shocked. And so that's why I left, and I didn't regret it. And the employees checked up on me and I was like, honestly, yeah, I'm chilling. It just wasn't my thing.
That sounds miserable. I mean, power to you if you enjoy it, I guess, but that sounds absolutely miserable to me. But that brings up a really interesting point, Avery. You were talking about real pain while playing, right? So I think a lot of what we've been talking about has been there's a large degree of artifice. There's absolutely no pain. There's absolutely no real death. But it also reminds me to think about the idea of we can play to deny death. We can also play to engage death. We can also play with the dead, which I think is interesting that there's no artifice to it, right? A couple of examples of this may be um, perhaps you've seen photos of like quirky funeral customs, right? Sometimes people, and quirky is maybe not a fair word, right? This may be very meaningful customs. These people I want to, I think anything that gives comfort and meaning is terrific. But at least, from the outside looking in, you might think of somebody at their funeral saying, "Hey, I liked basketball. Please arrange me as though I'm dunking a basketball," right? Or you have the bands that you see like in New Orleans, right? First line and second line. You have the Irish wake. You even have things like, and now I think there are different motivations for using things like a Ouija board. Um, I imagine maybe a fair amount of people maybe don't believe that it's real. They're just like, oh, okay, this is fun or this is spooky. But there are people who I think probably genuinely use it to play with a dead loved one, perhaps. So for them, it is real. They are playing with the dead in that moment. Y'all ever mess with playing with the dead? I don't know if I dare. How about like in terms of the lighter side of playing with the dead? I try to focus on being like a death positive scholar, right? So like for example, kind of like the ofrenda with the Dia de los Muertos, right? It's like, hey, we're gonna put out toys and food and treats, that my loved one, they're gonna come and they're gonna enjoy it. And we're gonna party with them tonight. And um, I know that on the anniversaries of my grandparents' deaths, my dad will put on a playlist of their favorite music. Now, I'm not an expert in play. I'm a lover of play, but I'm not an expert in terms of the academics of it. Would that constitute playing in terms of choosing a playlist and to remember? Would that be classified as playing?
Sounds like it to me. What do you think, Avery?
For me growing up, my family always had an altar at the front of our house that was red and Buddhist and Vietnamese and Chinese, and it was a big red altar with like little red lamps that had some Buddhist deities statues as well as framed photos of deceased relatives. And I was always taught to treat that as a very respectful place. A lot of rituals would happen with that altar, as well as the altars of other Buddhist temples. And if you go to a lot of Buddhist temples, people will bring photos of their loved ones and have and add it to a wall of other photos of deceased relatives next to the Buddhist deity statues. And that's a big part of Buddhist culture when they go to temples is to pray for their deceased ones and to light incense and to ring the gong and to bow and do certain rituals with that. And so I was always taught that it's kind of a respectful situation rather than a playful one. But that's funny because when I was a little annoying kid, I did not really understand temples and I thought that they were super boring. I was like, this is not fun at all. I'm bored. I want my toys. I'm just gonna run around this temple and like throw pillows and be really chaotic and treat this as a playground. And my parents would eventually, take me outside and whatever, but I didn't really get it when I was younger. And I wanted that place to be rather playful because other than that, I thought it was boring. But now I don't know if I would define that the kind of ritual traditions as playful. But even though, Schechner would probably describe it as uh, that deciphering point between a ritual versus a performance versus play or whatever.
Yeah, I wonder, Christian, if it has to do with the manner of the death, because I think in an ofrenda or something that is dedicated to someone who had a wonderful life, who had a life well lived, that's a little bit different than I'm thinking of maybe the little altars that you see on the side of the road sometimes where a traffic accident has occurred or something like that, where there is, or even after Princess Diana's death, when there were all of the remembrances, all of the pictures of her, all of the flowers. I'm wondering, Christian, whether the sort of solemn nature of those kinds of altars are making up for the fact that the person was taken too soon, or the person was taken in a manner that was kind of unnatural.
Yeah, Drew, that reminds me of a really powerful image that I saw online a couple of years ago. It was a picture that it's very disorienting at first in that I'll try to describe it as in much detail as I can. It's a grave site, and there are six young men, I'd say in their early 20s, shaved heads. I believe the casket is closed and it has an American flag over it. And there is one young man, also shaved head, about that same age, standing next to all of the guys in the suits, and he's wearing a bright green, like mini dress, one that you might see at a club, and he's hunched over, weeping. And the context is that all of these people were in the military together, and the person who died, the person in the coffin, and the young man in the bright green dress swore that if either of them ever died, the other would wear a ridiculous dress to their funeral. So it's a really moving image. I feel myself getting a little emotional thinking about it right now because it's tremendously moving. But in terms of somber, most certainly. Is it also play in that in the moment? I'm sure when they were discussing it, they were laughing. It was play in the moment, but then maybe when it became real down the road, it was no longer play. Instead, it was just like this really beautiful tribute. No longer play because it was too somber in that moment. That just I don't know why. And what you said maybe made me think of that.
And I know, speaking of graveyards, I know that for many years, Oscar Wilde's grave in, I think it's in Père Lachaise in Paris, people would come up. So Oscar Wilde, as befits Oscar Wilde, has a wonderfully theatrical tomb with its white marble and it's a sphinx and all, and it's big and it's just kind of like exactly probably what Oscar Wilde would have wanted, which actually, suggests the question of if you could design your own, grave site. I suppose that's a little bit playful too. But for years, people would come, and if they were devotees of Oscar Wilde, they would put on lipstick and they would kiss his tomb until Père Lachaise Cemetery finally discovered that this was eroding the marble, that there were so many kisses that they were going to have to stop people from kissing the tomb. So, Christian, you may know the answer to this. I think they put plexiglass in front of it and people can kiss the plexiglass. I'm not exactly sure. But there you go. There's a playful interaction. The same cemetery where Jim Morrison is buried, if people want to find Jim Morrison's gravesite, they people have spray painted Jim with arrows pointing you to his gravesite on other people's graves. And it's kind of like, I know you're looking for Jim Morrison. Let me help you figure out how to get there. So there's a little bit of play with monuments or with remembrances. So that's kind of your story. Your story made me think about that.
That is so rude.
For sure. I was at the St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans last year. And you go there, it's this amazing, amazing cemetery. You have the Voodoo Queen Marie Laveau there. But in the midst of this cemetery that has a lot of old headstones, beautiful kind of mausoleums and everything, there is a garish, giant pyramid. And it's huge. And that pyramid, that Irish pyramid memorial, will belong to Nicolas Cage when he dies. So he has pre-purchased a giant garish marble pyramid. He's not from New Orleans, to my knowledge. I think he just said he likes New Orleans, or he feels some sort of affiliation towards it, such that he wanted to be very much in the center of this beautiful historic cemetery. And to some extent, I feel like he's almost playing with his own death, or maybe he feels that's very reverent. Maybe he doesn't think it's garish because he's Nicolas Cage and he has some interesting sensibilities. But maybe that's like him playing with your own death to some extent, right? So it's an interesting idea.
Now, let's see. Avery, do you want to talk about jump scares?
Yeah, yeah. I don't like jump scares. I don't enjoy games that have jump scares or immersive experiences that have jump scares. I am glad that I've been able to work behind the scenes in terms of live entertainment and at Knott's Berry Farm, which is a theme park in Southern California. I have been part of building or putting props in some of the haunted mazes there. And I like walking through the mazes when the lights are on and you can kind of see things because I appreciate the technical parts of it. Kind of similar to the Phantom of the Opera chandelier falling as well. I think that is kind of the if I were to sit under that and not know that that would be part of the experience, I would probably I would probably never do theater. I would be scared away from theater. And this is for context, I am a professional scenic designer, so no, I will not leave the theater, but there's some sort of joy that I get out of being a part of helping people play the way that I've seen so many of my friends die on stage in my theater degree and just be able to congratulate them afterwards of putting on a great performance and my memories of greeting people once they escape the horror escape room, of being like, congratulations, I'm safe now, you can confide in me now, it's okay, like I'm not gonna keep scaring you anymore, even though I was the one pushing the buttons to scare them because it's my job. But I like the feeling of debriefing with people after, of like, hey, it's okay, you're not in danger or whatever. But I also love hearing like, yeah, what did you think of the maze? What did you think of the escape room? I'm sure as a dungeon master Christian, you probably also have had experiences of debriefing after maybe a scary session or a deathful experience, and that is part of the play as well, of debriefing after. Because if I had, if I finished the player's escape room and they escaped and I was just like, bye, all right, cool, I would not feel like, A, that's not really good customer service, and B, that's not very thoughtful of us as an employee or a person, to just have this person go through this heart wrenching or heart pounding experience and then not asking how they are afterwards too.
Most definitely. I found another study. It's from the same study I was talking about earlier that defined positive, negative experiences in pivotal play. They interviewed Dungeons and Dragons players about death within D&D. Out of the 20 people that they interviewed, 17 of them said that the most significant experience they've ever had playing D&D surrounded character death. So it is a huge part of the game. And yeah, as a dungeon master and as a death scholar, I feel like the stakes are really high for me to make the deaths matter. Whether they are bad deaths in that they need to be powerful and memorable and sometimes brutal, but in service of something, not just gratuitous. Sometimes they need to be good death in that they're expected but beautiful in a way, and that people have time to say goodbye. And I implemented a homebrew rule, homebrew essentially being like, it's not in the official rules, but I'm the dungeon master. I can do whatever I want. I'm going to make my own rule because I like it. Um, I basically have okay, so I borrowed it, but I tweaked it. It's a heroic death rule. So in Dungeons and Dragons, when your character's about to die, you do what are called death saving throws, which is basically you roll a die, and if you get enough bad rolls, you're dead. And if you get some amazing rolls, then you pop back to life miraculously. So when I have a character fail their saving throws, or when the die dictates that they have failed their saving throws and they are actually dead, I give them one last heroic gasp. They get one more turn, and whatever they do in that turn is a critical success. So double damage, what have you. So they get to go down swinging, I suppose. Um, Additionally, I allow them to grant essentially kind of like a wish to another character. So at some point down the road, they can say, I am using Evender's spark that he gave me when he died back in the swamp 4 sessions ago to succeed in this task that I'm doing. I'm sure the purists, the mechanical purists of Dungeons and Dragons, are going to be writing y'all hate mail for me saying this, but again, I don't care. I'm about the narrative, and I think the players seem to appreciate that they get a moment, right? They get a moment to be memorable and then remembered, and usually we do some sort of eulogy after the battle is done for the fallen comrades. And sometimes they die in really hilarious, wacky ways, and that's fine too. And we just laugh about how ridiculous that was. It's like, oh, you started a fire in the library and you couldn't get out of the library. Okay, what's your new character?
Yeah, there's a lot in the way that we teach people about death too, and I have yet to explain to a person what death is. What would you say to yourself if you had to explain to your younger self what death is?
Oh man, I think an understanding of what death is and what fear of death is has changed for me as I've gotten older. One thing I think that really stuck with me was when my maternal grandmother was nearing the end. So she was in memory care for a while, and when she was nearing the end, she started talking about seeing my grandfather and talking to my grandfather. And she would say, I talked to grandpa last night, and he told me about flying in an airplane and that he was excited to go on this trip and things like that, or just even mundane conversations that she had with him. And I think our family was a little bit split on this. Some family members kind of were of the opinion we have to tell Graham that this is not true. We have to keep her grounded as much as possible because she is kind of sliding into this space where she's not really aware of who is still alive, who is not, what day it is, where she is, who she's with, those kinds of questions. We got to keep her grounded. And then the other part of the family was sort of like, if she wants to tell us about talking to grandpa, let's just let her tell us about talking to grandpa. If she is, because A, who's to say that she's not talking to grandpa? I mean, she absolutely could be. And B, if this is giving her comfort, then why take away that comfort? And so I think going back to your question, if I were going to talk to myself as a little kid, I would say that it's one of those things that we still don't really understand. Famously in Peter Pan, Peter says death would be an awfully big adventure. But it seems like there is some kind of peace. And there's also the sense that those who go before us still are there with us, whether they are interacting with us or whether they are simply wherever they are, proud of us, still having emotional connections to what's going on Earth. I think that there is still a connection there that cannot be broken. So that would be my best effort.
There's a concept that you're kind of speaking about, Drew. It's called symbolic immortality, which is basically the idea that even though we die, something we all hope that something about us lives on, right? And people do all sorts of things to try to secure symbolic immortality. One of the more common ways would be to have children, right? If you literally are passing on your blood and your DNA and your stories, right? They will tell stories of you, and you'll continue to live on. Other people find other ways to have symbolic immortality. Putting this podcast out is giving us all a shred of symbolic immortality, that if someone finds it, even after we're gone, we live again for a moment, right? So, although I'm not a parent myself, I've never actually had to explain death to a child or someone who doesn't understand it. It certainly depends on the age and their understanding of it, right? But assuming that they have some experience of death, I think a worthwhile place to start is asking them, what do you think it is? What do you think happens? What do you connect to? And going from there, right? And even being humble in that, saying, to some extent, your guess is as good as mine, right? But what really matters is that we are talking about this person, and so they're alive right now. I think that's a cool way to do it. And again, I focus on the death positivity, right? So I don't even if that's a form of play. I'm not sure, but I sure find it comforting.
Well, I think to conclude, I found a pretty good quote in the preface to the script for the play 222, A Ghost Story, which is by Danny Robbins. And Robbins says this in this preface: whether we believe in them or not, ghosts are society's buffer between life and death. And a world without them, with every corner, nook, and cranny illuminated, leaving nowhere for the dead to hide, or for us to hide from death, that is a truly frightening idea. And so I think as we play with fear, as we play with our own mortality in all the different ways that we do, just kind of embracing the play, embracing the rehearsal for the things that in real life are frightening and that we do need to prepare for, or the things in real life that are sad and that we might need to prepare for, I think is one way that we can manage to control and that we can manage to perhaps find some kind of peace in a world where the stakes might be high and we might be gambling and we might think, well, house is always going to win, but at least we can find a way to play effectively. So I just love that quote from Robbins. I use it on the ghost tours too, just to kind of look at the very nebulous space that is there between what's going on here in the world and whatever comes afterwards.
I'll just, again, like to say thanks so much for having me on today. As a death scholar, I find one of the biggest paradoxes that I encounter with the other scholars that I talk to and other people, other strange people like me, is that the more we engage with death, the more meaningful our lives can be. I think accepting death as a part of life is really worthwhile. Accepting play as a vital part of life is extremely worthwhile. People should not be afraid of play, and people should play with death if they so choose.
Thank you so much, Christian, for being with us on this very special episode. You have made this discussion a very fun one to have, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy that too. This has been Powered by Play with Avery and Drew. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you can support us online at Ko-fi. That is ko-fi.com/poweredbyplay. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.